Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little sootier, the grimy, gaslit world of Victorian London. A city of grand ambition, industrial marvels, and soul-crushing poverty. This wasn't the London of Sherlock Holmes or Queen Victoria's palace garden parties. This was the London of fog, filth, and foul smells, a place where surviving the day was a small miracle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and the first thing you see is your brother's foot. Inches from your face, grimy, and twitching slightly from some horrifying dream. Welcome to your one and only room. It's not a bedroom, it's not a living room, it's the room. And it's everything. You share it with 6 other souls, 1 bed, 2 chairs with questionable structural integrity, and a rat who's been around so long you're considering charging him rent. There's no wallpaper, just patches of wall where something used to be. The ceiling leaks when it rains, and even when it doesn't, it drips something that you've decided not to investigate. The fireplace is fake, the air is damp. The floor creaks like it's trying to warn you of your own mortality. You're wrapped in a thin wool blanket that hasn't been washed since the Crimean War, and the pillow under your head is made of straw, possibly mixed with someone's long-forgotten sock. There's no plumbing. That bucket in the corner? That's the toilet, bath, and emergency water source, depending on the time of day and level of desperation. You've learned to breathe through your mouth in the mornings. It helps. A bit. There's one window, if you can call it that. So covered in soot and fog, it mostly just lets in the sound of cartwheels, shouting vendors, and someone aggressively coughing 3 doors down. You try not to think about the fact that the window opens onto an alley where the butcher dumps his offcuts and your neighbour keeps his goat. Every morning begins with a family-wide shuffle. You dress under blankets to avoid the cold. You swap spots around the wash basin like it's a game of musical chairs with fewer prizes, and someone always knocks over the chamber pot. And yet, somehow, this room is still home. You know which floorboard creaks, which corner drips, and which window pane rattles just before your neighbour yells about his stolen boots. You know the smell, the dust, the strange sense of belonging. But make no mistake, this room isn't comfortable. It isn't cute. It's a place that prepares you for the day outside by making you suffer a little before you even leave. And trust me, the streets won't be kinder. You stumble out the front door, still blinking sleep from your eyes and clutching half a crust of bread, and immediately walk face first into a wall of choking fog. But this isn't the romantic, candle-lit haze they write about in novels. No, this is London's infamous pea super, and it's like trying to breathe through a coal-stuffed sock. The sky is grey, the street is grey, the air is grey. You can't see the end of your own arm, and you're pretty sure that's a lamppost ahead. Or possibly a horse. Could go either way. This fog isn't just weather. It's murderous. Formed by the happy marriage of industrial coal smoke and natural mist, it clings to everything. It seeps into your lungs, coats your throat, and gives your clothes that signature London look, soot-streaked and mildly flammable. You cough. Everyone coughs. It's part of the local soundtrack, like church bells and clattering hooves. Children hack like lifelong smokers. Old men cough so hard they rattle windows. And doctors, well, they recommend moving to the countryside, which is great advice if you own land and your own lungs. The smell is a complex bouquet. Chimney soot, sewage vapour, horse manure, and last night's overcooked cabbage. If perfume makers bottled this, it would be called Eau de Urban Misery. And it gets into everything. Your hair, your bread, your one nice shirt you wear to funerals and job interviews. It's all stained with the scent of progress. The worst part? No one's surprised. People go about their day blindly, literally. Street lamps burn all day long and still don't help. You hear someone trip in the alley next to you, and someone else swear as their umbrella disappears into the mist like a ghost ship. At night, it gets even thicker. The fog curls through door cracks. It blankets the tenements, and if you don't keep a candle lit, you might walk straight into the fireplace, or worse, your neighbour's lap. So yes, the air in Victorian London doesn't just choke you, it brands you, smokes you, and dares you to keep breathing, and you haven't even reached the street market yet. You've made it out of bed, out of your smoke-soaked hovel, and down into the day's grey beginnings. Now your stomach groans. Time for breakfast. Except, breakfast in Victorian London is less of a meal and more of a ritual in lowered expectations. If you're part of the working class, and you almost certainly are, breakfast isn't eggs or toast or a hearty pile of bacon. It's a crust of bread that could double as a roof tile. Maybe some porridge, if the oats weren't eaten by the rats in the cupboard. And tea. Always tea. Not because it's comforting, but because it's boiled. And anything that's been boiled probably won't kill you. Milk? Only if you can afford it, and even then it's a gamble. It might be watered down or worse, preserved with formaldehyde by enterprising vendors who think child-safe is a loose guideline. Sugar is expensive. Butter? A legend. Jam? Only if your aunt died and left you some in her will. If you're lucky enough to work in a factory or live near a bakery, you might sniff warm bread on the air. Don't get excited. That's not your bread. That's someone else's breakfast, likely belonging to a man with a hat and a last name on his door. And if you're really down on your luck, an orphan, an out-of-work widow, or just someone who lost their job to a machine, you might find yourself queuing at a workhouse for a ladle of greyish gruel. It's warm. It's edible. That's about the kindest thing one can say. Street vendors might offer fried potatoes or old meat pies, but beware. The meat is unidentifiable, the oil ancient, and the odds of intestinal regret high. Still, the smell is oddly inviting. When you're starving, everything smells like hope. You eat quickly, standing, wrapped in your coat like a cloak of denial. There's no dining room, no soft morning music, just cold fog, clanging wheels, and the distant sound of someone already yelling about stolen coal. And now, bellies only half full and spirits not at all. It's time to step into the real monster, the streets of London. Welcome to the streets of Victorian London, a sprawling, chaotic organism, pulsing with smoke, mud, and misery. Every step you take is a calculated risk, and the street doesn't care if you're late for work or just trying to cross the road without being trampled to death. First things first, there are no sidewalks. Or if there are, they're so narrow, cracked and crowded that using them is a polite suggestion, not a safety guarantee. The main road is a mucky battlefield of hoofbeats, wagon wheels, and ankle-deep sludge. Horse-drawn carts barrel past at terrifying speeds. Carriages clip corners. One false move, and you're face down in a puddle that smells like something died in it, because something probably did. Now, mind the gutters. They run down the middle of the street, carrying all the city's discarded glory. Rotting vegetables, dead rats, coal ash, the contents of chamber pots dumped from upstairs windows, and the occasional shoe, foot optional. Crossing them without slipping requires Olympic-level balance, or a very long stick and no dignity. But it's not just the terrain that's out to get you. It's the people too. You've got street urchins darting around like caffeinated squirrels, pickpockets brushing against your coat, accidentally, and vendors yelling about eels, kippers, or something vaguely called meat. Everyone's yelling, all the time, about everything. There are also the coppers, trying to look important, while ignoring most of what's happening around them. If someone gets stabbed, they'll eventually wander over, assuming the shift hasn't ended, or they haven't been bribed to look the other way. The air, still thick with smog, now flavoured with horse manure and pipe smoke. And in the distance, you hear the bells of St. Paul's, Or maybe that's just your ears ringing after someone shouted in your face about chimney soot. Oh, and if it rains? Which it does. Often, the streets turn into rivers of filth. No one offers an umbrella. No one even looks surprised. You just pull your coat tighter and trudge through it, hoping your boots don't dissolve. And this is just your commute. Survive the streets, and you might live to find a job. Or at least something that pays enough to keep bread on the table and rats off your toes. You've navigated the sewers masquerading as streets, dodged horses and hooligans, and now it's time to make your living, if the city allows it. In Victorian London, a job isn't a title. It's a test of endurance, a way to slowly fall apart while clinging to the illusion of stability. If you're a man, you might be lucky enough to land work in a factory. 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that wouldn't feed a well-behaved cat. The noise is deafening. The air is full of soot, metal shavings and regret. If you lose a finger in the machine, don't worry. There are 20 children lined up behind you ready to take your spot. Don't fancy machinery. Try bricklaying, or hauling coal, or working in the docks where your back gives out by 30 and your teeth fall out by 40. If you live that long. Women, you're scrubbing floors, washing other people's laundry until your hands dissolve, sewing buttons until you forget what daylight looks like, all for pennies. And when those options run out, there's always the street. No sick leave, no safety, and no sympathy. Maybe you're a chimney sweep, or a mudlark, digging through the Thames at low tide, looking for scraps of rope, nails, or bones to sell. The smell is free. The dysentery? Also included. Or perhaps you've landed in a workhouse, that magical institution where the destitute are helped by being worked to the bone in exchange for food so bland it feels like a punishment. You're not here to thrive. You're here to not die too loudly. Jobs come and go. Illness doesn't. Injury means starvation. There's no workers' comp, no health insurance, and no HR department. Just a foreman yelling at you to lift faster, breathe quieter, and stop bleeding on the equipment. And heaven forbid you complain. There's always someone more desperate behind you, willing to work for even less. Competition is fierce, and compassion is scarce. So yes, you're employed, but don't get too excited. In Victorian London, a job doesn't pull you out of poverty. It just gives you something to do while you're in it. In Victorian London, childhood isn't a time of innocence. It's a short window before your back gives out and your lungs fill with soot. If you're small enough to fit inside a chimney, congratulations, you're considered employable. Forget toys and bedtime stories. By the time you're 5, you're already working. 6, if your parents are merciful. School is a luxury. Work is your future and your present. You might be a chimney sweep, crawling through narrow flues, scraping out soot while praying you don't get stuck. If you scream, they'll poke you with a stick. If you stop moving, they'll assume the worst and keep going. Or perhaps you're a match girl, dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus that poisons your jawbone until it glows in the dark and eventually falls off. The pay? A few pence? The hazard? Bone death. A charming trade-off. Some children are mudlarks, scavenging through the toxic sludge of the Thames at low tide, looking for nails, rope, anything remotely sellable. You emerge soaked, freezing, and likely infected with something Victorian science hasn't even named yet. Others hawk newspapers on the street, shout about roasted chestnuts they can't afford, or run messages for pennies. You run fast, dodge traffic, and hope today isn't the day you're trampled by a horse or beaten for looking the wrong way at the wrong man. Factory work? That's the dream. Indoors. Steady hours. Just ignore the amputations. Children clean under whirring machines, often while they're still running. You learn fast, or you lose a hand. No safety gear, no days off, no sympathy. Just sweat, noise, and an ever-present adult barking orders. And if you're an orphan, the world doesn't owe you anything. Workhouses, the street, or worse. Some are sold into service. Others vanish, absorbed into the fog, a footnote in someone else's story. In the eyes of Victorian industry, children are cheap, obedient, and disposable. Childhood isn't stolen, it's simply never offered. And yet somehow, they survive. They play with scraps, sing songs in alleys, and laugh. Between shifts, between coughs. Because they have to. Because in London even children are expected to carry the weight of empire on their tiny, soot-covered shoulders. If you thought surviving Victorian London was hard as a man, try doing it as a woman. You work. All the time. And no, you don't get applause or medals. You get calluses, exhaustion, and a society that expects you to smile while your spine collapses. If you're unmarried, you might be a domestic servant. That means scrubbing floors from dawn till dusk, hauling buckets of coal, blacking the hearth, ironing until your arms ache, and never sitting down unless someone tells you to. You eat last, you sleep in the attic, and if the master gets handsy, well, you should feel grateful, apparently. Married? That's not better. It's double duty. You clean your own home, likely a single filthy room, raise children, usually several, cook, with nothing, sew, everything, and manage the entire household budget with 3 shillings and a prayer. And then maybe you take in laundry from richer households, boiling, scrubbing, wringing, repeating, just to buy bread. Some women become seamstresses, stitching shirts in poorly lit corners for 14 hours a day. It pays pennies. It ruins your eyesight. And if your fingers bleed on the fabric, you lose the job. And then there's the match factories, where white phosphorus eats through your jaw, quite literally. You start with a toothache and end with a rotting face. Management says it's your fault for chewing gum, when none of that pays enough, or when you're widowed, orphaned, or just unlucky. The street becomes the only option. Sex work is legal, unofficially ignored, and socially condemned. You might make enough for food and rent, or you might get arrested, attacked, or worse. Protection? Only if you count wool gloves and luck. Women in Victorian London are expected to be quiet, clean, obedient, and always busy. You're the moral centre of the home, even if the home has no floorboards, no heat, and no future. There are no rights, no maternity leave, no safety net. Just other women, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, trying to survive the same nightmare. But somehow they do. With grim determination, whispered jokes, and backs bent by centuries of unpaid labour. And still, they find time to comfort their children and sweep the doorstep, because someone has to. You might have dodged the horses, survived the soot, and even landed a job. But in Victorian London, you can't dodge disease. It's everywhere, lurking in the water, the walls, the air, and quite possibly in the meat pie you ate for lunch. Illness doesn't knock. It sits beside you on the tram, sleeps beside you in your tenement, and sneaks into your lungs while you wait in line for bread. Let's start with the basics. Tuberculosis, or consumption, as they called it, because it slowly consumes your lungs, your body, and your will to live. The cough is deep, constant, and comes with blood. Everyone knows someone who has it. Most people just keep working until they drop. Then there's cholera, which arrives through your drinking water like a particularly cruel surprise. One minute you feel fine, the next you're vomiting, dehydrated, and desperately trying not to soil yourself in public. It spreads fast. Whole streets go silent. The local pump is chained up too late. By then the damage is done. Typhoid, scarlet fever, diphtheria, all regular visitors. Each has its own personality, but they all share one thing in common. They hit the poor the hardest. If you can't afford a doctor, and you can't, you're left with herbal remedies, homemade poultices, or the magical healing properties of hope. Of course, there's always laudanum, a beloved mixture of alcohol and opium sold over the counter. You've got a fever? Take laudanum. Cramps? Laudanum. Grieving the death of your 8th child? Double dose. You'll still die, but you'll die very relaxed. And what about the doctors? Well, they mean well. Sometimes. But medicine is still guessing with Latin. Leeches are still in fashion. Surgery is done without gloves. Antiseptics are a twinkle in Lister's eye. Your odds with a street barber aren't much worse. Disease doesn't discriminate, but your living conditions help it choose you faster. No sanitation, no ventilation, 10 people to a room. It's a perfect breeding ground for microbes, misery and mould. In Victorian London, if something doesn't kill you fast, it will kill you slowly. And if you're somehow still upright, time to refill your water. You're sweating through your soot-stained shirt, your lips are dry, and your throat feels like it's been sandpapered by coal dust. Time for a drink? Sure. But in Victorian London, water isn't your friend. It's a loaded pistol with a porcelain handle. Let's start with the Thames, the lifeblood of the city. It's also the toilet, the industrial dump, the animal graveyard, and, just for good measure, the city's main drinking water source. Imagine a stew of rotting vegetables, chemical runoff, dead dogs, human waste, and expired fish, flowing right past Westminster. Now pour a cup and say cheers. Don't worry, the water company says it's filtered. That means it's passed through a mesh of gravel, wishful thinking, and possibly someone's old boot. If you live in a working-class neighbourhood, your tap might come from a public pump down the street, which you share with 200 neighbours and 3 nearby factories. And the worst part? You might not even know it's deadly, until it's too late. Cholera loves bad water. So does typhoid. They swim freely through the pipes like microscopic sharks. Whole families are taken out within days. A shared bucket, a misused chamber pot, a splash from the wrong pump, and your headline material, if you're lucky. Bathing? Now that's adorable. Most people don't have bathtubs. If you're middle class, you might share one with the family once a week. If you're poor, it's a tin tub in the kitchen once a month, if that. And that same water might double as laundry rinse, dishwater, or a place to soak your aching feet. Hygiene is creative. The government starts installing sewers eventually, thanks to the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell from the Thames was so horrific that Parliament fled the building. It took stench to make change. Until then, you boil your water when you can, or drink beer, the safe Victorian beverage for children and adults alike. Weak, warm, and slightly fizzy with salvation. So yes, in Victorian London you can die from a glass of water. The trick isn't just avoiding thirst. It's avoiding where the thirst takes you. You've tried honest work. It's long, filthy, and barely pays enough to buy yesterday's bread. The water might kill you, the factory definitely will, and the rent collector doesn't take IOUs. So what's left? Crime. And in Victorian London, it's not just an act, it's a career path. Start small. Maybe you're a pickpocket, or a dipper, as the slang goes. You blend into crowds near the markets, bump someone gently, and vanish with a pocket watch or coin purse. Charles Dickens made Oliver Twist famous, but the real-life versions didn't get musical numbers. They got sent to Newgate Prison or shipped off to Australia. If you're a woman, you might become a fence, buying and reselling stolen goods in back alleys under layers of shawls and misdirection. Or maybe you run a twilight house, where pickpockets drop their loot before the bobbies come sniffing. Feeling bold? Become a costermonger swindler, selling bruised fruit or watered-down milk from a rickety cart, disappearing before complaints catch up. Or try your hand at forgery, card tricks, or the always popular 3-card Monte, a fast-talking scam with a faster getaway. And if you've really got guts? There's always burglary. Break into a warehouse, a merchant's shop, or, if you're desperate, a church. You might find something valuable. You might also find a constable with a billy club and no bedtime. The police force exists, but they're underpaid, undermanned, and often 2 steps behind. Plus, you can bribe the right officer if you know the system. And let's face it, you probably do. Crime syndicates in London were shockingly organised. Some had territories, code words, and full recruitment pipelines. Then there's the resurrection men, body snatchers who dig up fresh graves to sell corpses to medical schools. It's gruesome. It's illegal. It pays better than sewing buttons. Of course, the consequences are real. Get caught and you could be flogged, branded, jailed, or worse, transported to a penal colony. But if the alternative is starving on a cold street, well, risk has a certain appeal. Because in Victorian London, morality comes second to hunger. Crime isn't the opposite of work. It is work. And for many, it's the only job that hires. Let's say you've caught something. A cough, a fever. Maybe your leg's been run over by a delivery cart. Time to see a doctor. Good luck. Because in Victorian London, medicine is less healing science and more creative improvisation with sharp metal. Doctors are out there, sure. Some even wear coats. But unless you're wealthy, your first stop isn't a physician. It's a chemist, where the cure for every ailment is a small bottle of laudanum, opium in liquid form, ideal for anything from a sore throat to existential dread. It won't cure you, but you'll stop caring. Can't afford a chemist? Maybe there's a barber surgeon down the road. Yes, a man who cuts hair and also amputates legs. If your wound is infected, he'll saw it off. No anaesthesia, no antiseptic, just a stick to bite and a bucket to scream into. And don't even think about hospitals. They're overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and smell like old bandages and lost hope. The instruments aren't sterilised. Surgeons wipe their hands on aprons between patients. Germ theory exists, but many still think disease is caused by bad air and moral failure. If you survive the treatment, infection may finish the job. A splinter can become a death sentence. A toothache? That's 2 days from sepsis. And childbirth? Well, women go in with pain and come out with a baby or a gravestone. Sometimes both. Medical textbooks are filled with confidence and wrong guesses. You might be prescribed bleeding, mustard plasters, or a mild electrocution to stimulate the humours. They balance the body by draining it, mostly of blood, money, and hope. There are a few progressive doctors with new ideas. Cleanliness, hand washing, maybe even antiseptics. But they're usually mocked by their peers. After all, how dare anyone imply that a gentleman doctor's hands carry germs? So what do most people do when sick? They wait. They sip herbal tea. They light a candle and lie very still. Because every treatment carries a risk, and recovery often feels more accidental than intentional. You don't go to the doctor to get better. You go because you've run out of other options. And sometimes, just sometimes, you come back out alive. The sun sets, the gas lamps flicker to life, and the fog thickens like a shroud. You might think the city calms down at night, but this is Victorian London. When the light fades, the real dangers come out. Forget cosy firesides and quiet evenings. The streets belong to shadows, and they're not empty. The gaslight barely cuts through the mist. Everything is a silhouette, a hunched figure in the alley, a cloaked shape behind a lamppost, footsteps that echo one beat too many. If you're out alone, you're either lost or you've run out of better options. The police patrol in pairs, swinging their truncheons and trying to look menacing. But even the constables know certain alleys are best left alone. Criminals own the night, and most wear shoes softer than a copper's boots. Robbers, cutthroats, and pickpockets thrive after dark. And if your route takes you through Whitechapel or Limehouse, you hold your breath and walk faster. Not because of ghosts, though the fog does play tricks, but because someone might be watching. And in 1888, he might have a knife. If you're a woman, the danger triples. Men leer from corners. Offers are whispered. Some follow. Others don't bother whispering. The darkness hides everything. Faces, screams, and sometimes bodies. Even if you stay indoors, you're not always safe. Tenement buildings creak and groan. Rats scratch behind walls. Arguments erupt 2 floors down and end with breaking glass or breaking bones. Sometimes someone vanishes, and no one asks why. And let's not forget the fires. Chimneys spark, stoves tip, a knocked-over oil lamp ignites a sleeping mat. No smoke alarms, no fire brigade that arrives in minutes. just neighbours shouting and throwing buckets into a blaze they can't control. If you must venture out, you carry a candle or a lantern and hope the flame doesn't blow out in the wind. Or worse, draw attention. Because in Victorian London, night isn't rest, it's risk. The poor don't sleep peacefully. They sleep light, one eye open, one ear tuned to the creak of stairs. And for many, morning is just something to survive to. The morning arrives, or at least you assume it does. Because in Victorian London, light isn't so much seen as guessed at through the thick, suffocating smog. It rolls in like a living thing, a grey, greasy mist made of coal smoke, fog, chimney ash, and the weary sighs of 1,000 overworked boilers. It wraps around buildings, slinks into cracks, and settles in your lungs like a squatter who refuses to leave. You cough, again. You never really stopped. The smog irritates your throat, clings to your skin, and makes your eyelashes feel sticky. Everyone coughs. It's part of the daily soundtrack, along with the church bells, the clip-clop of hooves, and someone yelling about turnips. You wipe the windows. The cloth comes away black. You wash your hands. The water turns grey. Your clothes, no matter how often they're scrubbed, always smell faintly of smoke and despair. Even your curtains are stained with soot. They hang heavy and stiff, like they've seen too much. You think about opening the window. Then you remember what's outside. More smoke, more filth, and the smell of 12 chimney fires fighting for dominance. The worst of it? This is normal. Londoners live in a permanent twilight. The sun is a rumour. People squint to read. Children grow pale. Plants on windowsills die of asphyxiation. And don't even think about drying laundry outside unless you enjoy wearing soot-stained shirts with a hint of arsenic. During the infamous Great Smogs, the air becomes so dense that you can't see your own feet. People get lost walking home. Omnibuses crash. Boats collide on the Thames. In 1873, one fog lasted for 5 straight days and left over 270 people dead. The city barely noticed. The poor, of course, get it worse. Their fires burn cheap, dirty coal. Their walls are thin. Their lungs weaker. Children wheeze through winter like old dogs. If you reach adulthood without bronchitis, consumption, or mysterious blackened phlegm, you're a miracle. And yet, you go on. You light the stove. You step outside. You pretend not to taste the air. Because in Victorian London, the smog never ends. It just waits for you. You'd be forgiven for thinking Victorian London was all soot, sickness, and screaming. And mostly, you'd be right. But even in the dirtiest corners, under the weight of poverty and fog, something human still flickers. Because kindness, oddly enough, survives here too, though you often have to squint to see it. You might spot it in the shared loaf of bread passed quietly between neighbours, when one family runs out before payday, or in the woman who gives her last halfpenny to a barefoot child with bloodied feet. There's no reward, just a nod, and maybe a smile, rare and precious. Even in the darkest places, the tenements, the alleys, the workhouses, people look out for each other. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to prove that the city hasn't broken them completely. A mother shares her hot brick on a freezing night. A chimney sweep helps a new boy not get stuck on his first climb. A dying man gives his boots to someone who still has the strength to work. These aren't grand gestures. They're small, quiet, but they matter more than gold in a place where hope is a rationed luxury. The pubs help too. They're loud, smelly, overcrowded, and absolutely essential. It's where people gather to sing, to joke, to drink away their bruises and their sorrow. You might not afford meat, but you can share a laugh over watery ale. Even the street performers, the penny dreadful sellers, the blind fiddler at the corner, they all form a kind of patchwork comfort, reminders that not everything in the city is out to hurt you. Kindness here isn't naive. It's practical. It's born of shared suffering. Because when the system forgets you, when the rich pretend you don't exist, your only safety net is each other. And so, despite everything, the filth, the fever, the fog, people still love, still marry, still raise children, still hope. Because if you can find kindness in the gutter, a warm hand in the cold, a crust of bread, a half-hummed lullaby, then maybe the city hasn't won. Not yet. So, after 14 chapters of choking smog, rats in the walls, toxic water, and toothless chemists prescribing opium for a broken leg, ask yourself, honestly, would you survive Victorian London? Probably not. Let's be clear. This wasn't a city built for comfort. It was built on coal, sweat, and the crushed spines of the working poor. Every day was a battle. Against hunger, against disease, against landlords, factory foremen, constables, and the constant creeping sense that the world had forgotten you. Modern luxuries, soap, antibiotics, light switches, didn't exist. There were no social safety nets, no universal healthcare, no days off. Just another fog-choked morning where your goal was simple. Don't die before supper. You'd miss things, like toilets, toothpaste, tap water that doesn't try to kill you. You'd wonder why everyone stares at you for brushing your teeth or asking about vegetables. You'd miss showers. Oh, you'd miss showers so much. And yet, people did survive. Somehow. They endured. Not because they were superhuman, but because they had no other choice. They formed unions. They raised families. They organised strikes, wrote novels, played music on street corners, and clung to hope like it was the last piece of bread in the pantry. They laughed, yes, even in the fog. They found love in crowded slums, sang lullabies over screaming children, and danced in pubs after 16-hour shifts. They weren't just victims. They were tough, resilient, and painfully human. You probably wouldn't last a day, and that's not an insult. It's a reminder. The people who did. They carried the weight of an empire on their backs, often barefoot, often hungry, and almost always ignored. They built the world we now complain about in heated rooms with clean drinking water. So maybe it's okay that we wouldn't make it, but let's at least remember them. Not as soot-covered statistics, but as people who survived the impossible every single day. Gorgo was born into a city that didn't just break the rules, it redefined them. Sparta, unlike the rest of Greece, wasn't known for golden temples or philosophical debates. It was known for warriors. And Gorgo? She was born right at the top of that brutal food chain. The daughter of King Cleomenes I, one of the two ruling kings of Sparta. From the moment she took her first breath, Gorgo's life was already political. She wasn't some ornament to be married off for alliances. In Sparta, women could own land, speak in public, and be educated, a fact that shocked other Greeks. And Gorgo wasn't just any Spartan woman. As the king's only child, she was expected to observe, learn, and one day wield influence in a world dominated by hoplite shields and sharp spears. As a young girl, she likely witnessed royal councils where matters of war and diplomacy were debated with blunt urgency, and she paid attention. Her father Cleomenes wasn't the most stable ruler. In fact, some thought he was completely mad by the end. But he left Gorgo with an early understanding of how dangerous politics could be, and how sharp the knife edge of power truly was. There's a famous story. When she was only about 8 or 9 years old, a foreign ambassador tried to bribe her father to support the Persian Empire. While the adults whispered, young Gorgo stepped forward and boldly warned her father, "Father, you had better leave, or this stranger will corrupt you." That wasn't just precocious, it was fearless. Her father listened, and the man was thrown out of Sparta. The lesson? Gorgo had teeth, and people learned early not to underestimate them. So before she was even of marriageable age, Gorgo was already showing signs of political brilliance and steel-edged judgment. She wasn't just royalty by blood, she was royalty by behaviour. And in a society that admired discipline, clarity, and brutal honesty, Gorgo thrived. Her destiny was already in motion. Not as a passive queen in a gilded palace, but as a Spartan lioness ready to guard her people, and, if needed, speak louder than the kings themselves. Gorgo's marriage to King Leonidas was not a tale of courtly romance or opulent weddings. This was Sparta, where practicality reigned and weakness was despised. Leonidas wasn't just any Spartan man. He was a warrior through and through, known more for his silence and scars than for charm or poetry. But Gorgo was not looking for poetry. She was looking for power and a partner. By marrying Leonidas, she became queen. But unlike queens elsewhere in Greece, Gorgo didn't fade into the background. There were no secluded women's quarters for her, no endless weaving by candlelight. Spartan queens were expected to speak, to advise, to stand beside their kings as intellectual equals. And Leonidas knew exactly who he had married. Gorgo was clever, fiercely loyal to Sparta, and utterly unafraid to speak her mind, even to him. Their partnership was built on mutual respect. In the famously terse style of their people, they likely spoke few words, but every word counted. Gorgo, raised in the fire of politics since childhood, likely advised Leonidas on diplomatic tensions, Persian threats, and internal Spartan rivalries. While other Greek women were hidden from public life, Gorgo helped shape Spartan policy from within the palace walls and beyond. One of her most legendary moments came during the build-up to the Persian invasion. As tensions with Xerxes grew, Leonidas prepared to march north with his small army of 300 Spartans. Before he left, Gorgo, now a seasoned political mind, wasn't overcome with tears or begging. Instead, she offered him just 6 chilling words. "Come back with your shield," or on it. That wasn't just a farewell. That was an order. It was the ultimate Spartan command, reminding her husband that death in honour was preferable to life in shame. If he couldn't win, he was to die standing. And Leonidas did. At Thermopylae, he and his 300 fell to the last man, buying precious time for Greece to rally. His death would echo through history, but Gorgo's words would echo louder. She didn't just send her husband off to die. She helped forge the myth of Thermopylae itself. While Leonidas died a hero, Gorgo lived to protect the legacy, and perhaps to shape the empire his sacrifice tried to save. After Leonidas's death at Thermopylae, many queens would have slipped quietly into mourning, perhaps disappearing from the public eye. Not Gorgo. In fact, her influence only grew stronger. She had become more than just a widow. She was now the living symbol of Spartan resilience. And while statues were built for the fallen, Gorgo became a living reminder of why they fought in the first place. With Leonidas gone, Sparta was vulnerable, not just militarily, but politically. The war with Persia still raged, alliances were fragile, and tensions ran high across the Greek world. In this chaos, Gorgo acted as both guardian and strategist. Though we don't have detailed records of her day-to-day political maneuvers, several ancient sources, including Herodotus, make it clear. When matters of diplomacy or internal threat arose, Gorgo was consulted. She wasn't just included, she was trusted. One story tells of a hidden message sent to the Spartans on a wooden tablet. The text had been scraped away and replaced with wax to disguise its contents, a warning about Persia's coming invasion. The men of the Spartan court were baffled, but Gorgo, calmly assessing the strange tablet, instructed them to scrape off the wax. Beneath it, the original message revealed the dire news. Gorgo had solved a diplomatic riddle that could have cost Sparta everything. Her insight likely saved thousands of lives. But Gorgo's genius wasn't just in puzzles. She understood the fragile web of alliances that held the Greek city-states together, and the threat that Persian gold posed to it. While Athens and other cities were notoriously vulnerable to bribes, Gorgo's sharp warning from childhood still applied. Beware of gifts that reek of corruption. She encouraged a stance of uncompromising honour, even when it was politically risky. And the Spartans listened. Because when Gorgo spoke, it wasn't with the softness expected of women in most of the ancient world. It was with the precision of a soldier, and the clarity of a strategist. She knew what was at stake, not just Sparta's land, but its very soul. Even in grief, Gorgo remained unshaken. The shield Leonidas carried into battle may have been lost, but Gorgo became something greater, the mind that would carry Sparta through its darkest days. To understand Gorgo's significance, you have to understand what it meant to be a woman in Sparta, and how Gorgo took that already rare privilege and amplified it into something nearly legendary. Spartan women were unlike any other in the ancient world. While Athenian women were confined to the home, barred from politics and barely educated, Spartan women were trained to be physically strong, mentally sharp, and socially assertive. This wasn't just cultural flair, it was survival strategy. Spartans believed that strong women produced strong sons, so girls ran, wrestled, and trained alongside boys in their youth. They were expected to be healthy, confident, and unafraid to speak blunt truths. But Gorgo wasn't just one of many tough Spartan women. She was the finest example of what Spartan womanhood could be. She was known not just for her wisdom, but for her razor-sharp wit. There's a famous anecdote where a foreign woman asked her, "Why are you Spartan women the only ones who rule your men?" Gorgo didn't hesitate. She shot back, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." That line wasn't just clever, it was pure Sparta. It signalled a culture where female strength was seen as essential, not ornamental. In Gorgo's world, motherhood wasn't a passive role. It was a political one. To raise a Spartan son was to train a future warrior. And for Gorgo, raising her own son, Pleistarchus, who would become king after Leonidas, was an act of devotion not just to family, but to the entire Spartan state. She likely oversaw his early education, surrounded him with the values of honour, sacrifice and discipline, and instilled in him a love, not for glory, but for duty. Yet Gorgo never flaunted her power. She didn't need to. Her voice carried weight precisely because she used it sparingly, and always with precision. She wasn't a ruler in name, but a force in reality. While Sparta remained a dual monarchy led by men, Gorgo's presence ensured there was always a keen-eyed strategist watching from behind the throne. In many ways, she was the unspoken law of Sparta, upholding its ideals, pushing its leaders, and sharpening its spine. Gorgo didn't just redefine what it meant to be a queen, she redefined what it meant to be a Spartan. The death of Leonidas at Thermopylae was a seismic moment, not just emotionally but politically. He had become a martyr for all of Greece, a symbol of resistance against Persian tyranny. But Sparta could not afford to weep for long. War was still raging, and the decisions made in the months that followed would determine the fate of the entire Greek world. And while Gorgo held no official rank, her influence didn't vanish with her husband's body. With her son, Pleistarchus, still a minor, a regency had to be established. While historical records don't list Gorgo as a formal regent, we can be sure she had a role in guiding his education and shaping the political decisions made in his name. This wasn't a time for grieving mothers. This was a time for cold calculation. The Persian threat was still looming, and Greece was deeply divided. Athens wanted to fight on sea, Sparta on land. Unity was fragile. It was likely during this critical period that Gorgo became something of an unofficial advisor to the Spartan Gerousia, the Council of Elders. She understood both Persian cunning and Greek pride, and more importantly, she understood how to balance Spartan honor with practical survival. Sparta could not afford to be reckless, nor could it afford to look weak. Gorgo had seen what unchecked ambition did to her father Cleomenes, and she had learned how to walk the tightrope of power. She would have been present as Sparta debated its next steps, whether to march north again, whether to commit troops to the naval battle of Salamis, or whether to defend the Peloponnesus and let the rest of Greece fend for itself. These were not easy decisions, and they were being made by men who had just lost their king in a blaze of glory. Gorgo's presence, rational, emotionally controlled, and deeply patriotic, may have been the anchor Sparta needed. There is no record of her giving orders, but there didn't need to be. Spartan queens led through example, not decree. Her mere survival, her unshaken presence, was itself a kind of leadership. In a city obsessed with honor, Gorgo had already proven that she could carry the shield. And now, without Leonidas, she carried the memory of his sacrifice into every political decision that followed. As the war against Persia raged and the years passed, Gorgo's role subtly shifted, from queen consort to queen mother, from political influencer to guardian of legacy. Yet she was never a relic of a past era. Gorgo remained a living embodiment of Spartan ideals, a presence so formidable that even without a crown or battlefield, she still commanded attention. Her son, Pleistarchus, eventually took the throne, but he was not the kind of king his father had been. Quiet, less known, and largely absent from military glory, Pleistarchus ruled in the long shadow cast by Leonidas. And behind him, still watching, was Gorgo, the woman who had raised him, shaped him, and ensured he understood what it meant to carry the blood of a hero. But what made Gorgo exceptional wasn't just her connection to two kings. It was her mind, her reputation, and the rare fact that she appears by name in multiple ancient sources, something extremely uncommon for women in classical history. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, mentions her more than once, praising her intelligence and recounting her ability to solve riddles and navigate political threats. In a world where women were often nameless shadows, Gorgo stood out, not as a myth or a lover or a tragic figure, but as a mind to be reckoned with. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of what Sparta wanted to believe about itself. A society where even women were strong, wise, and ready to defend their homeland at any cost. Gorgo didn't need to fight with a spear. She fought with words, with counsel, with unwavering resolve. Her contributions weren't made on dusty battlefields, but in war councils and private conversations, in raising a king and keeping a nation emotionally intact during its darkest hours. Even centuries later, her name remains one of the few ancient Spartan women preserved by history. Not because she was a queen, but because she was impossible to forget. In an age when the achievements of women were easily erased, Gorgo's intellect, sharp tongue, and political bravery left a mark too deep to wash away. She didn't inherit greatness. She carved her own version of it. And Sparta, brutal and uncompromising as it was, loved her for it. Sparta prized few things: silence, strength, and discipline. But Gorgo managed to make her voice one of its sharpest weapons. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words were remembered for centuries. She was living proof that in a culture where words were precious, the right ones could echo louder than shields clashing in battle. Gorgo was a master of Spartan wit, a form of verbal warfare all its own. She didn't use metaphors or flowery speeches. She used the truth, delivered like a knife to the heart of pretense. One of her most quoted responses came when a foreign woman asked, "Why are Spartan women the only ones who rule their men?" Gorgo's reply was legendary. "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." The line wasn't just a jab, it was a manifesto. In 6 words, she summarized the entire Spartan worldview and female empowerment the way only a Spartan could, with blunt, blistering pride. She used language like a general uses tactics. When she exposed the bribe attempt to her father as a child, she didn't stammer or plead. She issued a warning. When Persian messages came hidden in wax, she offered the solution without hesitation. Gorgo didn't just speak. She strategized through words, and Sparta listened. In a male-dominated society built around the sword, Gorgo showed that intellect could be a battlefield too. Her statements have the rhythm of command and the clarity of someone who understood power, not as ornamentation, but as responsibility. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She made every word a dagger. And what made her words so devastating was that they were always anchored in truth. She didn't bluff. She didn't flatter. Gorgo knew exactly what was expected of her. As a queen, as a Spartan, as a woman who had seen kings fall and wars ignite. She met those expectations head-on, not with emotional outbursts, but with calculated, unforgettable replies. Her voice was her weapon. Her intellect was her armour. And while many queens are remembered for their tears or their beauty, Gorgo was remembered for what she said, and for never saying anything she didn't mean. In Sparta, that was the highest form of respect anyone could earn. Gorgo's later years were spent in a city that never softened. Unlike other Greek polis that evolved into cultural centres, Sparta refused to compromise its militaristic identity. It remained rigid, proud, and dangerously insular. And Gorgo, still standing tall amidst its stone and bronze, witnessed the long consequences of Leonidas's sacrifice, not only for Sparta, but for Greece itself. The Persians were eventually repelled, yes, but victory came at a price. Sparta emerged from the Persian Wars with immense prestige, hailed as the protector of Greek freedom. But with honour came rivalry. Athens, fueled by democracy and ambition, grew in wealth and influence, slowly drifting from ally to adversary. Tensions simmered, and a new storm was brewing, the Peloponnesian War. It was a conflict that would define the next generation of Spartans, including Gorgo's own son. If Gorgo saw the writing on the wall, she likely recognized that Sparta's strict ideals, once its greatest strength, were now becoming limitations. While Athens adapted and innovated, Sparta remained unmoved. The same military codes that once made Sparta invincible also made it inflexible. But Gorgo, ever pragmatic, likely accepted this reality with the same steel-eyed clarity she had shown all her life. She had lived through more than one kind of war, not just the ones with spears and arrows, but wars of diplomacy, of shifting alliances, of internal unrest. By now, Gorgo had likely become a living relic in the best sense of the word, a link to Leonidas, a symbol of what Sparta once was, and a reminder of what it might become again if it stayed true to its core without losing its mind to arrogance. No records survive describing her final days, but there's no reason to believe she met them with anything less than calm resolve. She had already done more than most women, and most men, of her time. She had ruled without ruling, fought without a sword, and shaped a city that didn't even allow its kings to indulge in softness. If Gorgo mourned, she did so privately. If she hoped for the future, she kept it to herself. Because in Sparta, emotions were not for display, legacy was, and hers was already secured in bronze and blood. Gorgo of Sparta didn't need marble statues or epic poems to be remembered. Her legacy was etched in something far stronger, the collective memory of a city built on discipline, honour, and defiance. Unlike other queens whose stories were wrapped in tragedy or romance, Gorgo's tale is one of sharp intellect, political savvy, and enduring pride. She stood at the intersection of two of Sparta's greatest icons, daughter of King Cleomenes, wife of King Leonidas, and yet she was never overshadowed by either. She wasn't a footnote in their stories. She was a chapter all her own. Historians and scholars still marvel at how frequently her name appears in the writings of Herodotus, not as a passive royal, but as a decisive figure. In a world that almost never recorded the names of women, Gorgo cut through the silence like a spear through a shield. What makes her legacy even more profound is that she never held official power. She didn't command armies or sit on the throne. She advised, she warned, she solved, she raised a king, and through it all, she embodied the terrifying dignity of Sparta itself, a city that chose death over disgrace, silence over boasting, and action over rhetoric. Her most quoted words, "Come back with your shield, or on it," are more than a farewell. They are a philosophy, a distilled version of the Spartan code. And though they've been repeated, repainted, and even repurposed in modern times, they still carry the cold fire of their original context. A queen sending her husband to his death, not with tears, but with a command to uphold honour. Today, Gorgo stands among the rare few ancient women who are remembered not because they were tragic, beautiful, or scandalous, but because they were respected. She shattered expectations in a society already notorious for doing the same. Her intellect was so pronounced, her voice so respected, that she became woven into the fabric of Sparta's identity. She may have lived over 2,000 years ago, but Gorgo remains a figure of relevance, for every woman underestimated, for every strategist who works behind the scenes, for every voice that refuses to whisper. She is a timeless reminder. Strength isn't always loud, and power doesn't always wear a crown. In the heart of Jordan's sun-bleached deserts, where the horizon seems to melt into the sky and silence reigns over the sands, stand the remains of a forgotten royal ambition, the desert castles. These haunting structures, scattered across the desolate landscape, seem almost like hallucinations. Grand facades rising out of the emptiness, complete with domed roofs, decorated arches, and faint traces of long-faded frescoes. They are beautiful, mysterious, and isolated. And they've puzzled historians for centuries. Built during the Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th and 8th centuries, these castles weren't built to repel armies or defend trade routes. They weren't fortresses in the traditional sense. Instead, they were luxurious retreats, seasonal residences, pleasure palaces, and hunting lodges for the Umayyad elite. Kings, princes, and high-ranking officials used these spaces as getaways from the politics of Damascus, the capital of the Islamic world at the time. And rather than hide from the harshness of the desert, they embraced it. But why build such lavish structures in such remote and unforgiving places? Part of the answer lies in the symbolism. The Umayyads were asserting control, not just over land, but over nature itself. By erecting these palaces in the desert, they were sending a message. Even in the harshest conditions, their power, culture, and sophistication would flourish. These buildings were monuments to Umayyad authority, artistry, and confidence. There's also a practical layer. Many of the desert castles were built near seasonal water sources or ancient trade routes, allowing them to serve as way stations or administrative hubs. Yet despite their utility, the architecture and decoration suggest something deeper. These were places of beauty and leisure. The walls once shimmered with frescoes depicting animals, musicians, and even Byzantine-style nudes, a surprising sight in early Islamic art. There were stargazing chambers, elaborate bathhouses, and audience halls with intricate carvings. Today, many of the desert castles lie in ruins, partially buried by the sand they once defied. But even in decay, they tell a story of a time when the desert was not a place to escape, but a place to transform. In these silent stones, the Umayyads left behind more than architecture. They left an echo of empire, ambition, and oasis-born luxury. To understand the desert castles of Jordan, we must step into the mindset of the Umayyads, the first great Islamic dynasty, rising from the sands of Arabia to rule an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. Their capital in Damascus pulsed with political power. But the Umayyads were still very much products of their tribal, nomadic roots. The desert wasn't something to be avoided. It was their origin story, the crucible that had shaped their ancestors. And so, instead of leaving the wilderness behind, they brought civilization into it. The Umayyads were consolidating their rule in a rapidly expanding empire. They needed to display authority, but also legitimacy. What better way to impress local tribes and foreign envoys than with palatial retreats in the middle of nowhere, built with cosmopolitan flair and imperial elegance? These desert estates served as venues for diplomacy, hunting expeditions, and elite gatherings, far from the watchful eyes and political intrigue of Damascus. But these weren't crude hunting lodges. They were sophisticated, often blending Roman, Byzantine, and Persian architectural influences. The Umayyads had inherited the architectural vocabulary of the lands they conquered, and they weren't afraid to mix styles. Some of the castles featured mosaics of grapevines, fountains framed with Corinthian columns, and frescoes filled with mythical creatures. This eclectic blend of east and west sent a clear message. The Umayyads were not just desert warlords. They were heirs to a broader, multi-civilizational legacy. In places like Qasr al-Mashatta, you can still see intricate stonework adorning the outer walls, with floral and geometric designs that suggest a fusion of Islamic restraint and Greco-Roman exuberance. At Qusayr Amra, frescoes depict bathing scenes, musicians, and even a painting of the Six Kings, an image showing rulers from Byzantium, Persia, and Ethiopia paying tribute to the Umayyads. It was visual propaganda carved in pigment and plaster. These castles weren't just about comfort, they were about image. The Umayyads understood that power needed a stage. In these desert theatres, far from the noise of the capital, they performed dominance, luxury, and cultural sophistication. They used the emptiness of the desert like a canvas, and on it they painted a vision of empire that was both ancient and utterly new. Among all the desert castles, none captivates the imagination quite like Qusayr Amra. Located deep in the Jordanian desert, it looks modest from the outside, a squat structure of dusty stone, half buried in the vast stillness of its surroundings. But step inside, and you enter a different world. Walls alive with images, colours that defy the harshness outside, and frescoes that whisper secrets from 13 centuries ago. Built in the early 8th century, Qusayr Amra is thought to have been commissioned by Caliph al-Walid Fais or one of his princes. It served as a pleasure palace and bathhouse, part spa, part political retreat, part cultural statement. The building features a domed audience hall, several bathing rooms, and a vaulted ceiling painted with the constellations, an Umayyad observatory hidden in the desert. But it's the frescoes that make Qusayr Amra extraordinary. Covering nearly every surface, they depict a world far removed from modern assumptions about early Islamic art. There are images of dancing women, wine drinking, musicians strumming lutes, hunting scenes, and even Greek mythological figures like Hercules. The ceiling of one room shows the zodiac and personifications of the planets. Another wall features the Six Kings fresco, a powerful piece of propaganda showing rulers from distant lands seemingly bowing to the Umayyads, reinforcing the idea that the desert, too, was part of their dominion. This bold use of figural art has sparked debate for decades. Islamic art is often associated with aniconism, the avoidance of human and animal figures, but Qusayr Amra proves the early Islamic world was far more complex. The Umayyads weren't just building religious spaces. They were creating secular ones, where luxury, astronomy, and power could mingle in visual celebration. And yet, time has taken its toll. Many frescoes are faded, their colours dulled by centuries of wind and heat. But restoration efforts have helped preserve their haunting beauty. Today, Qusayr Amra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a rare glimpse into the Umayyads' intimate, hedonistic, and politically charged vision of rulership. In the middle of a dry, empty plain, Qusayr Amra still whispers of courtly songs, hot baths, and starry ceilings. It is not just a building, it is a desert dream, painted in defiance of time. Qasr al-Qarana rises like a mirage from the desert plains east of Amman, a massive, symmetrical box of limestone and precision. From a distance, it looks like a military stronghold. Thick walls, narrow slits resembling arrow loops, and no visible entrance from 3 sides. But here's the twist. Qasr al-Qarana isn't a fortress. At least, not in the traditional sense. Its secrets lie not in warfare, but in its puzzling design and uncertain purpose. Built around the early 8th century, this desert structure is one of the best preserved Umayyad castles, yet scholars remain divided over what it actually was. Despite its fortress-like appearance, there are no real defences, no battlements, no water source, and no evidence of a standing garrison. The narrow slits may have let in light, but they wouldn't have stopped attackers. So why the armoured disguise? The prevailing theory is that Qasr al-Qarana served as a caravanserai, a roadside inn for traders, travellers, and diplomats crossing the desert. Its 60 or so rooms, arranged over 2 floors around a central courtyard, could easily accommodate guests, servants, and animals. It may have also functioned as a meeting point for tribal leaders, a space for the Umayyad administration to exert influence over the Bedouin tribes who controlled the routes of the desert. Inside, the structure reveals more subtle sophistication. There are vaulted ceilings, decorative niches, and even traces of plasterwork. The second floor features rooms that may have been used for gatherings or negotiations, private enough to conduct business, but grand enough to impress. Some of the graffiti etched into the walls suggest literate guests from diverse regions, offering clues to its wide usage. Qasr al-Kharana feels like a riddle, built to look like a fortress, but behaving like a salon. Its very ambiguity may have been intentional. In a time of expanding borders and political uncertainty, appearances mattered. The structure signalled strength, stability, and hospitality, all at once. Today, visitors can walk through its echoing corridors, peer out through the narrow windows, and imagine what deals, arguments, and alliances once echoed within. It is a castle of shadows and subtlety, more diplomatic chessboard than battlefield. In the emptiness of the Jordanian desert, Qasr al-Kharana stands not as a monument to war, but as a stage for politics and pageantry. Qasr al-Mashata may be ruined today, but even in its fragmented state it dazzles with ambition. Located just south of Amman, this Umayyad palace was never fully completed, yet its unfinished bones still whisper of imperial dreams. Among all the desert castles, Qasr al-Mashata is perhaps the most architecturally elaborate, and its surviving facade is one of the finest examples of early Islamic stonework in existence. What immediately strikes visitors, and historians, is the extraordinary stone relief that once adorned its southern facade. Carved with geometric patterns, floral motifs, and stylized animals, the wall is a stunning fusion of Byzantine, Sasanian, and early Islamic artistic traditions. It's a visual manifesto of the Umayyad identity, powerful, cultured, and inclusive of the civilizations it had conquered or inherited. Ironically, much of the facade isn't in Jordan anymore. In the early 20th century, the Ottoman Sultan gifted part of it to the German Kaiser. Today, the largest surviving portion resides in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, a fragment of desert glory displaced into European marble halls. But even without it, the ruins at Mashhata remain remarkable. You can still see the carefully arranged foundations, the outlines of a grand courtyard, and hints of the richly ornamented entrance hall. So what was Qasr al-Mashhata meant to be? Most scholars believe it was intended as a winter palace, not just a retreat, but a royal statement. Its scale and artistry suggest it was meant to impress visitors, perhaps foreign dignitaries or tribal allies. The palace would have featured audience halls, private quarters, courtyards, and even a mosque, all part of a self-contained oasis of power in the desert. But then, construction abruptly stopped. Some say the death of Caliph al-Walid II, who commissioned it, led to its abandonment. Others point to structural issues or shifting political priorities. Whatever the reason, Mashhata was left incomplete, its vision frozen mid-dream. And yet, the ruin still commands respect. Even unfinished, Qasr al-Mashhata tells a clear story. The Umayyads were not just warriors or rulers. They were builders of culture, masters of design, and visionaries who dared to bring luxury into the most desolate of landscapes. Mashhata may have fallen silent, but its carved stones still speak the language of empire, bold, intricate, and enduring. It might seem strange at first, elaborate bathhouses in the middle of the desert. But for the Umayyads, hammams were more than just places to wash. They were spaces of ritual, relaxation, diplomacy, and even celestial contemplation. Scattered throughout the desert castles of Jordan, these bath complexes stand as testaments to how the Umayyads brought civilization and comfort into one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Take Qusayr Amra, for example. Behind its painted walls lies a complete Roman-style bath system, apoditarium, changing room, tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot steam room, and a furnace system underneath to heat it all, just like the old Roman thermae. The technology wasn't new, but the intent was freshly Islamic. The Umayyads had absorbed the knowledge of their conquered territories and adapted it to their own needs. In a world where water was precious, having a functioning bathhouse was a sign of serious wealth and power. It demonstrated the caliphate's ability to manipulate nature, not just survive it. Bathing wasn't just hygienic, it was social. Here, rulers and courtiers could relax, host tribal leaders, or discuss matters of state away from the prying eyes of the court. It was intimacy wrapped in ceremony. And then there's the art. In the steam-filled walls of these hammams, we find frescoes that challenge expectations, zodiac signs, planetary figures, bathing women, musicians, hunting scenes. The ceilings in some bathhouses even resemble ancient planetariums, especially in Qusair Amra, where constellations are meticulously painted across the dome. It's as if the act of bathing was elevated into a cosmic experience, linking the physical cleansing of the body with the spiritual vastness of the heavens. This embrace of luxury wasn't decadence, it was calculated. The Umayyads weren't Puritans. They believed that showcasing their refinement was a way to legitimize their power. And in the desert, where luxury was scarce, a steaming bath was as much a political statement as a military parade. These hammams, tucked inside lonely palaces, offered not just water, but culture. Places where sand gave way to steam, and where the stars above were mirrored in painted ceilings below. They remind us that even in exile from the capital, the Umayyads lived not with austerity, but with elegance and intention. One of the most mesmerizing and overlooked aspects of Jordan's desert castles is how many of them seem designed not just for comfort or politics, but for the stars. In a time before telescopes and apps, the night sky was both map and mystery. The Umayyads, inheritors of Greco-Roman science and Persian cosmology, looked to the heavens with both spiritual reverence and intellectual curiosity. And they brought that fascination into the architecture of their desert retreats. In Qusair Amra, for example, the bathhouse dome is painted with an astrological sky. The zodiac signs, constellations, and celestial symbols circle the ceiling in a rich blend of science and art. This is not decoration for decoration's sake. It reflects a deep understanding of astronomy, likely inherited from the scholars and scribes of the Byzantine and Persian empires. The Umayyads weren't just warriors, they were cultural sponges, absorbing the best of what the ancient world had to offer. The presence of these celestial themes may have had multiple layers of meaning. On one hand, they signalled the caliphate's knowledge and sophistication. On the other, they echoed a more mystical relationship with the cosmos, the belief that power on earth was mirrored in the stars. Aligning one's rule with celestial order wasn't just good politics, it was divine symbolism. In the quiet of the desert, far from the lights of the cities, the night sky would have been overwhelming, black velvet lit with thousands of stars. The desert castles, with their open courtyards and domed chambers, were ideal observatories. Whether for calculating calendars, navigating the desert, or engaging in more esoteric practices, these sites were perfect for skywatching. The combination of isolation, silence, and celestial awe must have created a setting that was as spiritual as it was scientific. It's worth remembering that early Islam was not at odds with science. In fact, the Umayyad era helped lay the groundwork for what would later become the Islamic golden age of astronomy. These castles, built in the middle of nowhere, were part of that intellectual lineage, not just places to bathe or rule, but to contemplate the heavens. In stone and pigment, the Umayyads carved their place between earth and sky, desert kings with their eyes on the stars. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the desert castles of Jordan is their sheer remoteness. Why would the Umayyads build lavish palaces, richly decorated bathhouses, and star-studded observatories so far from any major city or settlement? The answer lies not just in geography, but in psychology, politics, and performance. First, there's the practical. The early Umayyads were still rooted in their nomadic, tribal past. For them, the desert was not an obstacle, it was home. The open landscape offered familiarity, privacy, and freedom. Building in the desert allowed the caliphs and their princes to retreat from the constant pressure of court life in Damascus and reconnect with their roots. These weren't outposts, they were sanctuaries. But the isolation also served a deeper purpose: symbolic domination. Constructing monumental architecture in the middle of an arid wasteland was an intentional act of power. It demonstrated that even the most barren, inhospitable lands could be tamed and transformed by the will of the caliph. These castles sent a message: that Umayyad authority extended beyond cities and farms into the very heart of nature's emptiness. Remote placement also ensured secrecy and exclusivity. These castles were where sensitive negotiations could unfold, where tribal leaders could be wooed with gifts and luxury far from the rumours and rivalries of urban politics. The solitude created space for diplomacy, indulgence, and experimentation, whether that meant engaging with foreign customs or enjoying figural art forbidden in stricter religious settings. Additionally, the locations were often more strategic than they appeared. Some castles sat near seasonal trade routes or vital water sources. Others acted as administrative checkpoints, keeping tabs on Bedouin tribes or serving as resting points for messengers and caravans. Their locations may have looked remote on a map, but in the political topography of the early Islamic Empire, they were well-placed chess pieces. And finally, there's the aesthetic. The vast emptiness of the desert served as a backdrop that amplified the majesty of the structures themselves. The contrast between barren land and intricate stonework made these castles feel like miracles, man-made oases of culture and elegance standing in proud defiance of nature. Their remoteness wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Each desert castle was a quiet roar, declaring that refinement, rule, and beauty could bloom even where nothing else dared to grow. The desert castles of Jordan may no longer echo with the footsteps of caliphs, diplomats, or stargazers, but they endure, quiet relics of an empire that dared to inscribe its grandeur into emptiness. And today, they serve a different purpose. They are windows into a vanished world, drawing in scholars, tourists, and dreamers who walk their sand-swept halls in search of forgotten stories. Modern Jordan has embraced these sites not only as historical treasures, but as symbols of cultural resilience. Castles like Qusayr Amra, Qasr al-Kharana, and Qasr al-Mashata are now protected heritage sites, with Qusayr Amra proudly wearing its UNESCO World Heritage Site status. Restoration projects, carefully balancing preservation with authenticity, have stabilized frescoes, cleared debris, and opened these ruins to public exploration. Still, time and nature remain persistent adversaries. The harsh desert climate, intense sun, dry winds, and sand erosion continue to threaten the delicate artwork and structures. Conservationists face the daunting task of protecting sites that were never meant to last over 1,000 years, let alone face modern tourism and climate challenges. But the effort persists, driven by a sense that these ruins hold not just artistic or architectural value, but spiritual and cultural insight. For modern visitors, these castles provoke wonder and questions. How could such beauty exist in such isolation? What does it say about the nature of power, art, and survival? Walking through Qusayr Amra's painted chambers, or gazing through the narrow windows of Qasr al-Kharana, one is struck not by decay, but by the persistence of memory. And in a broader sense, the desert castles remind us that the early Islamic world was far more diverse, creative, and open than often portrayed. These structures challenge assumptions about art in Islam, about luxury in the desert, about the boundaries between East and West. They reveal a dynasty that was at once rooted in tradition and hungry for innovation. Today, The castles stand alone again, surrounded by silence and stone. But they are no longer forgotten. They speak, not with shouts, but with whispers, about a civilization that saw the desert not as a void, but as a stage. And against all odds, their story still travels across the sands, echoing into the modern world. Imagine a world without numbers, without writing, without even the concept of months or hours. This was the world of our Paleolithic ancestors, yet even then time moved and people noticed. Before there were calendars, timekeeping devices, or even language to describe it, early humans tracked time by watching nature. The rhythm of the earth, its light, its seasons, its sky, was their only clock. The most obvious cycle was the day itself. Sunrise and sunset divided time into light and dark. But beyond that, humans quickly learned to observe the moon. Its phases were consistent and dramatic, a glowing disk growing, shrinking, and disappearing with eerie regularity. The moon became the first timekeeper, dividing life into repeating units that would later inspire the idea of months. In fact, the word month itself comes from moon. To early humans, a full lunar cycle, about 29.5 days, meant far more than a pretty light in the night sky. It was a guide for hunting, planting, gathering, and preparing for what came next. But the moon wasn't alone. Shadows changed length throughout the year. The position of the sun at sunrise shifted along the horizon, and certain stars only appeared during specific seasons. Over generations, communities began to notice these patterns, and more importantly, to pass them on. This knowledge wasn't just observational, it was sacred. Understanding time meant understanding the gods, the land, and life itself. Ancient people carved notches into bones, painted symbols on cave walls, and aligned stones with the sun's rising point during solstices. These weren't primitive scribbles. They were early efforts at marking the passage of time. Some of the oldest known calendars come from 30,000 years ago, antler bones with carved tally marks, possibly tracking moon cycles or menstrual cycles, both deeply tied to survival and fertility. In the absence of clocks, early humans lived in tune with nature's cues. Time was not abstract. It was the breath of the earth. It told you when to move, when to hunt, when to hide, and when to hope. Before time had numbers, it had meaning. And before it had names, it had stories, etched in stone, passed by firelight, and guided by the heavens above. For ancient humans, the moon wasn't just a source of light, it was a clock written in the sky. Its phases were predictable and mesmerizing, waxing crescent to full moon, then waning to darkness before the cycle began again. This roughly 29.5-day rhythm was the earliest and most universally observed natural cycle. Long before civilizations rose, hunter-gatherers across continents were counting moons. Not years or weeks, but moons. These lunar phases became the foundation of the first real calendars. We know this because archaeologists have found engraved bones and stones with carved markings in repeating sequences, likely tallying the days between each visible moon phase. Some of these artifacts are over 30,000 years old, predating writing and even agriculture. One such find, the Ishango bone from Central Africa, contains a series of notches that many scholars believe correspond to a lunar calendar, perhaps even one used to track fertility or hunting seasons. Why the moon? Because it was the easiest way to see time change. Solar changes happened slowly, and stars required deep knowledge. But the moon was obvious, shifting every few days and offering a sense of progress. For early humans, especially nomadic ones, this was practical and reliable. A month was a complete moon cycle, and 12 of those came close to a full solar year, though not quite. This mismatch would cause problems later, especially for agricultural societies that needed more accurate planting schedules. As civilizations began to form, many cultures formalized these lunar calendars. The Babylonians, Egyptians, Chinese, Maya, and Hebrews all used versions of lunar timekeeping. Some, like the Islamic calendar, remain strictly lunar to this day. Others began adjusting, adding leap days or months to sync the moon's cycle with the solar year. But in these early stages, the moon reigned supreme. The calendar wasn't just a tool, it was a sacred map. The moon was often personified as gods, goddesses, or celestial beings who watched over the people. Its cycles were tied to festivals, rituals, and myths. In tracking the moon, early humans weren't just measuring time, they were giving it meaning. The moon taught us to count. And in counting, we began to understand time not as an endless blur, but as something that could be held, named, and passed on. As human societies evolved from nomadic bands to settled agricultural communities, the moon alone was no longer enough. Farming required more than knowing when a month had passed. It demanded precise awareness of the seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, when rains would come or frost would return. And for that, early humans turned to the sun. Unlike the moon, the sun's movements were subtle, stretching across the horizon over the course of a year. But those who observed patiently began to notice a pattern. The sun did not rise and set in the same place every day. At certain times of year, what we now call the solstices and equinoxes, the sun reached key turning points. These became cosmic anchors, marking the longest and shortest days, and the times when day and night balanced perfectly. Ancient people began to build solar calendars, not with ink, but with stone. The most famous example is Stonehenge in England. Though its exact purpose remains debated, its alignment with the summer and winter solstices is unmistakable. On those days, the sun rises or sets perfectly in line with specific stones. In a world without clocks, this was breathtaking precision. Similar alignments appear across the globe, in the Nabta Playa stone circle in Egypt's desert, in Chaco Canyon in North America, and in the temples of Machu Picchu. These weren't random. They were built by sky watchers who connected celestial events with agricultural cycles and religious rituals. For these ancient societies, the sun was more than a giant torch. It was divine. Many cultures worshipped solar deities, Ra in Egypt, Inti in the Andes, Surya in India. The return of the sun after the longest night was often cause for celebration, symbolizing rebirth and continuity. These festivals, aligned with solar events, eventually formed the backbone of early religious calendars. Tracking the sun required patience, architecture, and spiritual vision. It meant observing not just 1 month at a time, but a full solar year, mapping the sky, recording the horizon, and marking time with permanence. Where the moon gave us motion, the sun gave us structure. Through stones and shadows, humans began to bind the heavens to the earth. And in doing so, time was no longer just a cycle. It became a calendar, carved into the land, aligned with the stars, and wrapped in the sacred. For early civilizations, tracking time wasn't just about agriculture or seasons. It was a spiritual act. Time itself was sacred, a divine rhythm flowing from the heavens into daily life. Each moment had meaning. Each season carried cosmic weight. Calendars weren't simply charts, they were instruments of ritual, designed to align human behavior with the will of the gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests climbed ziggurats not just to be closer to the sky, but to observe the stars and planets. These observations weren't purely scientific. They were acts of devotion. The Babylonians divided time with stunning accuracy. A 7-day week, a 360-day year, and even a base 60 number system that still influences how we measure minutes and degrees. But this wasn't about efficiency. It was about order. By measuring time, they were mirroring the divine structure of the universe. Egyptians took it even further. Their calendar, one of the most advanced in the ancient world, was tied closely to the Nile and the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. When Sirius reappeared at dawn, it signaled the flooding of the Nile, a life-giving event. That celestial moment, marked the start of the Egyptian New Year, a celebration tied to fertility, rebirth, and the favour of the gods. Across the ocean, the Maya developed one of the most intricate calendar systems ever devised, combining lunar cycles, solar years, planetary motions, and sacred numbers into an interlocking series of time counts. Their Tzolk'in calendar tracked a 260-day spiritual cycle, while the Harb tracked the 365-day solar year. Time for the Maya was not linear. It was cyclical, divine, and deeply bound to prophecy and ritual. Every moment had a spirit. Every date had a destiny. Festivals, sacrifices, coronations, and even wars were timed to coincide with celestial rhythms. Kings were crowned not just when politically convenient, but when the stars aligned. To ignore the calendar was to invite chaos, not just in the fields, but in the cosmos. In this world, to keep time was to hold power, not over people, but over meaning itself. Sacred time governed the lives of ancient civilizations, and through sun, moon, and star, the calendar became not just a record of passing days, but a bridge between the mortal and the divine. As civilizations grew more complex, so too did their need to organize time beyond months and seasons. The concept of a year, a full cycle of Earth's orbit around the Sun, slowly took shape. But understanding that a year lasted about 365.25 days wasn't easy. It took centuries of observation, correction, and yes, frustration. The earliest formalized years were often imperfect. Lunar calendars, while useful, created a problem. 12 lunar months only added up to about 354 days, nearly 11 days short of the solar year. Over time, this gap caused chaos. Harvest festivals began to drift into the wrong season, and spring rituals occurred in the heart of winter. Civilizations had to make a choice: stay loyal to the moon or correct the drift. Many opted for the latter. The Babylonians created a lunar calendar but added an intercalary month every few years to realign the calendar with the seasons. The Egyptians, however, took a bolder step. They abandoned the moon entirely and adopted a solar calendar. 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 extra days tacked on at the end. This was revolutionary and incredibly accurate for its time, but the Egyptian year still lagged behind the true solar year by a quarter of a day. Over centuries, this caused a noticeable drift. New Year festivals fell later and later. Enter the Romans, who inherited both Egyptian and Greek timekeeping and attempted to clean it up. Their early Roman calendar was a confusing blend of lunar months and political manipulation. Months were added or removed based on political needs, causing enormous inconsistencies. It wasn't until Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BCE that things changed. Advised by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, Caesar implemented a 365-day year with a leap day every 4 years, accounting for that pesky extra quarter day. It was a monumental fix and the first truly solar calendar to gain widespread use across an empire. The idea of a year became not just a tool for farming, but for taxation, governance, military campaigns, and religious observances. The calendar now shaped empires. The invention of the year was humanity's triumph over chaos, a decision to place order on the swirling sky. And once we'd named the year, we began to measure everything within it, giving history its rhythm and civilization its pulse. With the year defined, humanity's next challenge was to break it down, to carve the vast stretch of days into manageable, meaningful chunks. This gave rise to months and weeks, 2 inventions that added rhythm to our timekeeping and stitched the fabric of daily life into something predictable and sacred. Months, at their root, come from the moon. Most ancient societies initially based their calendars on lunar cycles, the 29.5-day rhythm between full moons. 12 of these created a lunar year, totaling roughly 354 days. But since this didn't align with the 365-day solar year, societies began to manipulate the system, adding leap months, adjusting day counts, or switching entirely to solar-based months, like the Egyptians and, later, the Romans. The Romans are largely responsible for the names and shapes of the months we use today. Their early calendar started in March, and months were named after gods, like Martius for Mars, numbers, September for 7, and later emperors, July for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus. Through political reforms, most notably Caesar's Julian calendar, the 12-month solar calendar became standardized with months ranging from 28 to 31 days. But what about the week? That strange 7-day unit that doesn't neatly divide a month or a year. Its origins are more mystical than astronomical. The Babylonians, fascinated with the number 7, derived it from the 7 visible celestial bodies: the Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. They assigned each day to a planet, a practice that influenced later Greek and Roman naming systems and survives today in many languages. The Jews solidified the 7-day week through religious tradition. In Genesis, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. This sacred structure was adopted and carried through into Christianity and Islam, eventually spreading across the Western world. By the time the Romans adopted it in the 1st century CE, the 7-day week had become a fixture, not because it was logical, but because it was meaningful. Unlike months and years, the week has no natural basis. It's a human invention, a rhythm imposed on time. Yet it endures, shaping work schedules, religious observance, and social life across centuries and civilizations. By breaking time into months and weeks, humanity gave time rhythm, and rhythm in turn gave us ritual, rest, and routine. As civilizations matured, calendars evolved from tools of survival into instruments of power. Whoever controlled the calendar controlled not just the seasons, but society itself. Taxes, festivals, harvests, royal decrees, and even war campaigns were governed by the date. Calendars became political tools, religious statements, and cultural weapons, used to shape identity, unify empires, and reinforce authority. In ancient Rome, Julius Caesar's reform of the chaotic Roman calendar wasn't just a bureaucratic fix, it was a statement. The new Julian calendar, introduced in 45 BCE, imposed order over disorder. It allowed the Roman Empire to synchronize administration across vast territories, from Britain to Egypt. And with July renamed in Caesar's honor, the calendar itself became a monument to his legacy. Later, Augustus Caesar followed suit, naming August after himself and adjusting its length to equal July, because no emperor wanted his month to be shorter than his predecessors. In Rome, even time had to flatter power. Meanwhile, in China, imperial dynasties created calendars tailored to the reigning emperor's mandate. The Chinese calendar, a sophisticated lunisolar system, wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. When a new emperor rose, a new calendar cycle often began, reinforcing the idea that he had inherited the mandate of heaven. The calendar reflected cosmic harmony and the emperor's place within it. The Islamic calendar, established during the reign of Caliph Umar in the 7th century CE, began with a political and spiritual event, the Hijra, or Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina. Unlike solar calendars, it remained purely lunar, making religious festivals float through the seasons. That fluidity, however, became a unifying thread, tying Muslims across different regions and climates to the same spiritual timeline. Even in medieval Europe, calendars became battlegrounds for authority. The Church aligned saints' days and religious festivals with pre-existing pagan cycles to ease conversion. Time itself was baptized. The calendar didn't just tell people what day it was, it told them how to behave. Calendars weren't neutral. They were curated by those in charge, defining when debts were due, when armies marched, when gods were honored, and when history began. From emperors to priests, kings to astronomers, the right to mark time became a form of dominion, because to shape the calendar was to shape reality itself, to make your story the rhythm of everyone else's life. By the 16th century, time itself had drifted out of sync. The Julian calendar, once a masterpiece of Roman engineering, had slowly lost accuracy. It miscalculated the solar year by about 11 minutes annually, a small error that, over centuries, added up. By the 1500s, the spring equinox, which once fell around March 21st, had crept backward to March 10th. For a church that depended on precise dates to celebrate Easter, this was a theological crisis. Enter Pope Gregory XIII, who in 1582 launched the most significant calendar reform in history, the Gregorian calendar. Guided by Jesuit astronomers and mathematicians, the Pope's solution was both simple and radical. To realign the calendar with the actual solar year, 10 days were dropped. October 4th, 1582, was immediately followed by October 15th. Time itself was rewritten. But the reform didn't stop there. Gregory's team also revised the leap year rule. The Julian calendar added a leap day every 4 years, but that was too generous. The new rule kept the leap year every 4 years, unless the year was divisible by 100, unless again it was divisible by 400. So 1600 was a leap year, but 1700, 1800, and 1900 were not. This corrected the long-term drift and brought the calendar's accuracy within 26 seconds per year of the solar cycle. Still, adoption wasn't immediate or universal. Protestant and Orthodox nations viewed the Gregorian calendar with suspicion, seeing it as a Catholic power play. England didn't adopt it until 1752, by which point the error had grown to 11 days. Russia didn't switch until after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918. The result? For centuries, dates could differ drastically between countries. Imagine two people celebrating New Year's 2 weeks apart in neighbouring lands. Despite resistance, the Gregorian calendar eventually became the global standard, not because of religion, but because of practicality. As science, navigation, commerce, and international diplomacy grew, the world needed a shared system of time. The Gregorian calendar was simply too precise, too useful to ignore. This wasn't just a correction. It was a revolution in how humanity experienced time. With the stroke of a papal pen, the world's days were recalibrated, and modern timekeeping was born. In the end, the Gregorian reform did more than fix Easter. It aligned the human clock with the celestial one, once again making time a dance between heaven and earth. Today, the calendar feels ordinary, something printed on smartphones, office walls, and kitchen magnets. But behind its grids and numbers lies a legacy thousands of years in the making, a journey from sacred ritual to mechanical precision, from observing the stars to syncing with satellites. Timekeeping, once the domain of priests and astronomers, is now a global system, standardized, regulated, and relentlessly ticking. We now use the Gregorian calendar almost universally. It governs everything from international law to shipping schedules, space missions, and the Olympic Games. But while this calendar dominates, others still exist, echoing ancient rhythms. The Islamic Hijri calendar continues to guide religious life for millions of Muslims. The Hebrew calendar governs Jewish holidays and traditions. The Chinese lunar calendar shapes festivals like the Lunar New Year. In India, regional calendars coexist alongside the Gregorian one. Humanity didn't abandon its diversity. It simply added layers of utility on top of ancient roots. And then there's atomic time, the most precise method of timekeeping ever created. Based on the vibrations of cesium atoms, International Atomic Time, TAI, measures seconds with such accuracy that it would only gain or lose 1 second every hundreds of millions of years. From this, we derive Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, the global time standard used for everything from internet protocols to airline schedules. Leap seconds are sometimes added to UTC to account for Earth's slightly inconsistent rotation, a reminder that, even in the age of perfection, the planet itself refuses to be completely predictable. Yet despite all this precision, we still live according to rhythms that are deeply human. We celebrate birthdays. We look forward to the weekend. We count down to midnight on New Year's Eve, hearts full of hope, just as ancient people once watched the horizon for the return of the sun. The calendar, in its modern form, is both tool and tradition. It keeps airplanes from colliding, yes, but it also reminds us when to gather, when to rest, and when to remember. Behind its cold efficiency lies the same desire that drove our ancestors to carve notches into bones and align stones with the sky. The yearning to understand our place in time. In measuring time, we measure ourselves, past, present, and the dreams that await tomorrow.